Words have failed repeatedly, explanations have dissolved into frustration, and every attempt at communication has been met with withdrawal or deflection. The empath exhausts themselves trying to bridge the gap with language, believing that if they could just express themselves correctly, the avoidant would finally understand and respond. Yet the talking creates more distance, the explaining generates more confusion, and the pursuit deepens the avoidant's retreat. What the empath rarely discovers until desperation forces the shift is that silence accomplishes what thousands of words could not. When the empath stops chasing, stops explaining, stops filling the void with anxious communication, something fundamental changes in the dynamic. The avoidant's internal world shifts when met with quiet rather than pursuit. Silence communicates strength where words communicated need. Boundary where explanations communicated flexibility. Self-possession where pursuit communicated dependency. The avoidant cannot manipulate silence, cannot twist quiet into evidence of the empath's dysfunction, cannot use withdrawn presence as fuel for their defensive narratives. Silence forces the avoidant to confront the relationship's actual emptiness without the empath's efforts obscuring the void. This communication without words reveals truths that verbal expression never reached, truths about investment, capacity, and the reality of what the avoidant can actually offer. Silence communicates what words never could. The empath's natural response to disconnection involves increased communication. When the avoidant withdraws, the empath attempts to bridge the distance through talking, explaining, questioning, and seeking understanding. The empath believes that clarity will resolve the tension, that if they can just articulate their feelings correctly or understand the avoidant's perspective fully, connection will be restored. This belief drives the empath to pursue verbal engagement even when previous attempts have yielded nothing but frustration. The empath fills silences with words, interprets the avoidant's withdrawal as invitation for more explanation, and equates communication with progress toward resolution. Yet this verbal pursuit actually reinforces the dynamic the avoidant has cultivated. The avoidant's defensive structure relies on maintaining emotional distance while keeping the empath engaged enough to prevent abandonment. When the empath pursues through words, the avoidant can deflect, minimize, or create confusion without ever addressing the actual relational issues. The avoidant responds to the empath's questions with vague answers that provide no real information. They meet the empath's vulnerability with intellectual analysis that avoids emotional engagement. They transform the empath's attempts at connection into opportunities for further withdrawal, claiming they feel pressured, overwhelmed, or misunderstood by the empath's communication. Silence disrupts this pattern entirely. When the empath stops verbal pursuit, the avoidant loses their primary tool for maintaining controlled distance. The avoidant can no longer deflect questions that are not being asked, cannot claim to feel overwhelmed by communication that has ceased, cannot present the empath's words as evidence of excessive neediness or dysfunction. Silence removes the avoidant's ability to use the empath's communication as justification for their withdrawal. The quiet creates a psychological space that cannot be filled with the avoidant's usual defensive maneuvers. The communication that occurs through silence operates on a different level than verbal exchange. Silence conveys self-containment, the capacity to exist without requiring the avoidant's response or validation. When the empath stops seeking understanding through words, they communicate that they no longer need the avoidant to explain, justify, or make sense of their behavior. This shift registers in the avoidant's awareness as fundamental change in the relationship's power dynamic. The empath's silence suggests they have moved beyond hoping for change, beyond believing in explanations, beyond investing in the avoidant's potential for emotional availability. Silence also communicates boundary in ways words cannot. The empath's previous verbal attempts at setting boundaries often dissolved under the avoidant's resistance. The empath would express their needs or limits, the avoidant would respond with defensiveness or withdrawal, and the empath would return to explanation and pursuit. This cycle taught the avoidant that the empath's stated boundaries held no actual weight, that enough distance or deflection would bring the empath back to pursuing connection. Silence enforces boundary without negotiation. The quiet states unambiguously that the empath will no longer engage in the pursuit-withdrawal dynamic, regardless of the avoidance response. The psychological impact of this silent boundary exceeds anything verbal assertion could achieve. The avoidant cannot argue with silence, cannot convince the empath to resume pursuit through manipulation or guilt. The quiet removes the avoidant's access to the relational dance they have choreographed. When the empath stops dancing, the avoidant must either step forward into unfamiliar territory or reveal through their own silence that they lack investment in genuine connection. Either outcome provides the empath with information that years of verbal communication failed to clarify. Silence communicates the empath's internal shift from relationship anxiety to self-focus. The avoidant has become accustomed to the empath's attention being directed outward, focused on understanding the avoidant, accommodating the avoidant's needs, and managing the avoidant's emotional unavailability. When the empath becomes silent, their attention redirects inward. The quiet signals that the empath has stopped making the avoidant the center of their emotional world. This shift terrifies the avoidant in ways that words of frustration or hurt never did. The empath's verbal expressions of pain still centered the avoidant, still communicated investment and continued pursuit. Silence suggests the empath's investment has fundamentally altered. The avoidant's defensive system has no prepared response to genuine silence. They have learned to handle the empath's words through deflection, intellectualization, or withdrawal. They expect verbal pursuit and know how to maintain distance while keeping the empath engaged. Silence represents unknown territory. The avoidant cannot determine what the quiet means, cannot control its interpretation, cannot use it to reinforce their narrative about the relationship. The uncertainty this creates penetrates the avoidant's defenses more effectively than any amount of verbal communication. Silence also removes the avoidant's ability to reframe the empath's legitimate needs as excessive demands. When the empath pursues through words, expressing hurt or requesting emotional presence, the avoidant transforms these reasonable desires into evidence of the empath's neediness. The avoidant suggests that anyone wanting emotional availability must be codependent, that expressing hurt demonstrates instability, that requesting presence reflects poor boundaries. These reframings protect the avoidant from acknowledging their own emotional poverty. Silence cannot be reframed as neediness. Quiet self-containment contradicts every narrative the avoidant has constructed about the empath's supposed dysfunction. The avoidant's internal shift when met with quiet. The avoidant's psychological equilibrium depends on maintaining controlled distance while ensuring the empath remains available. This delicate balance allows the avoidant to avoid the vulnerability of true intimacy while preventing the abandonment they unconsciously fear. The empath's pursuit serves crucial regulatory function for the avoidant. When the empath chases, the avoidant feels simultaneously desired and safe in their distance. The pursuit confirms the avoidant's worth without requiring them to risk genuine connection. This dynamic allows the avoidant to maintain their defensive structure while avoiding the loneliness that complete isolation would create. When the empath becomes silent, the avoidant's internal equilibrium destabilizes. The quiet removes the reassurance that the empath remains invested and available. The avoidant can no longer rely on the empath's pursuit to confirm their desirability while they maintain emotional distance. This loss of reassurance triggers anxiety that the avoidant typically manages through increased withdrawal. Yet withdrawal no longer serves its usual function when the empath has already become quiet. The avoidant's retreat meets empty space rather than anxious pursuit, eliminating the satisfaction that withdrawal typically provides. The avoidant begins experiencing cognitive dissonance as their expectations of the empath's behavior clash with the reality of sustained silence. The avoidant has internalized a working model of the empath as someone who pursues, who seeks understanding, who fills silences with attempts at connection. The empath's silence contradicts this model, creating psychological discomfort that demands resolution. The avoidant must either update their understanding of the empath or find ways to provoke the familiar pursuit. Many avoidants initially attempt provocation, creating situations designed to trigger the empath's old patterns of verbal engagement. These provocations might take various forms depending on the avoidant's typical strategies. Some avoidants manufacture crises that would previously have summoned the empath's concern and caretaking. Others display sudden warmth or vulnerability intended to draw the empath back into pursuit. Still others escalate their withdrawal, believing that extreme distance will eventually break the empath's silence and restart the familiar dynamic. When these provocations meet continued quiet, the avoidant confronts the unsettling possibility that the empath has genuinely changed rather than simply employing a temporary strategy. The internal shift deepens as the avoidant recognizes that silence communicates something their defensive structure cannot easily dismiss. The avoidant has learned to discount the empath's verbal expressions of hurt or frustration, interpreting them as temporary emotional states that pursuit withdrawal patterns can manage. Silence registers differently in the avoidance psychology. The sustained quiet suggests decision rather than emotion, boundary rather than reaction, fundamental shift rather than temporary upset. This recognition penetrates defenses that verbal communication could not breach. The avoidant begins experiencing the discomfort of their own emotional unavailability without the distraction of managing the empath's pursuit. Previously, the avoidant could focus on the empath's communication, analyzing it, deflecting from it, or withdrawing from it. This focus on the empath's behavior allowed the avoidant to avoid examining their own relational patterns. Silence eliminates this convenient distraction. The quiet creates space where the avoidant must sit with their own feelings, their own desires, their own fears without the external focus that the empath's pursuit provided. This forced self-focus often triggers profound discomfort in the avoidant. Their entire defensive structure exists to prevent exactly this kind of internal examination. The avoidant has organized their psychology around external focus, achievement, control of circumstances, and management of others' perceptions. When silence removes the external engagement they have relied upon, the avoidant confronts aspects of their internal world they have spent years avoiding. They may experience anxiety they cannot attribute to external circumstances, loneliness they cannot blame on others' inadequacy, or desire for connection they cannot reconcile with their defended position. The avoidance response to this discomfort reveals their actual capacity for relationship growth. Some avoidants use the discomfort as catalyst for genuine self-examination, beginning to question the defensive patterns that have governed their relational life. These avoidants may seek therapy, engage in authentic self-reflection, or risk vulnerability in ways they have previously avoided. Their response to the empath's silence involves actual behavioral change rather than manipulation designed to restore the old dynamic. They step toward the empath with genuine presence rather than the intermittent gestures that characterize their previous pattern. Other avoidants respond to the discomfort by intensifying their defensive structure. They reframe the empath's silence as abandonment, cruelty, or game playing. They construct narratives that position themselves as victims of the empath's withdrawal while conveniently forgetting years of their own emotional unavailability. They may seek new sources of attention and validation to replace what the empath's pursuit previously provided. These responses reveal that the avoidant lacks genuine capacity or willingness to engage in the vulnerability that authentic connection requires. Their reaction to silence exposes that their attachment to the empath was never about the empath as a person, but about the regulatory function the empath's pursuit served. Silence breaks the pursuit dynamic the avoidant requires. The pursuit-withdrawal cycle represents the avoidant's fundamental relational strategy. This pattern allows the avoidant to maintain connection without genuine intimacy, to feel desired without risking vulnerability, to control emotional distance while preventing abandonment. The cycle operates with predictable rhythm. The avoidant withdraws emotionally, the empath pursues seeking connection, the avoidant retreats further, citing the pursuit as justification, the empath intensifies efforts to bridge the gap, and the avoidant occasionally offers minimal engagement to prevent the empath from completely disengaging. This dance can continue indefinitely as long as the empath continues pursuing. The avoidant requires the empath's pursuit for multiple psychological functions. The pursuit validates the avoidant's worth without demanding they reciprocate vulnerability. When the empath chases, the avoidant receives confirmation of their desirability and importance. This external validation substitutes for the internal sense of worth the avoidant has never developed. The pursuit also allows the avoidant to maintain their self-narrative as independent and self-sufficient. By positioning themselves as the pursued rather than pursuer, the avoidant can interpret their emotional distance as strength rather than limitation. The pursuit serves another crucial function by providing the avoidant with control over the relationship's emotional temperature. When the avoidant feels too much closeness developing, they withdraw, and the empath's resulting pursuit creates the distance the avoidant needs. When the avoidant experiences too much distance and the loneliness becomes unbearable, they offer minimal engagement, and the empath's eager response provides connection without requiring sustained vulnerability. The avoidant uses the empath's pursuit as instrument for regulating their own discomfort around intimacy and isolation. Silence dismantles this entire regulatory system. When the empath stops pursuing, the avoidant loses their primary tool for managing emotional distance and connection. The quiet eliminates the dynamic that has allowed the avoidant to have relationship without the risks that relationship entails. The avoidant can no longer withdraw and rely on the empath's pursuit to confirm their worth. They cannot use the empath's chasing as justification for further distance. They cannot offer minimal engagement and expect the empath to flood them with relieved affection. The familiar pattern that has protected the avoidant from genuine vulnerability collapses. The avoidant experiences this collapse as deeply destabilizing. Their relational approach has organized around manipulating the pursuit-withdrawal dynamic rather than developing capacity for mutual emotional presence. When silence removes the pursuit, the avoidant must either develop new relational capacities or accept the relationship's dissolution. This forced choice confronts the avoidant with their actual limitations. They cannot maintain connection through the familiar pattern. They must risk authentic presence or lose the relationship entirely. The psychological pressure this creates varies in intensity based on the avoidant's actual attachment to the empath. If the avoidant's connection to the empath is shallow, based primarily on the regulatory function the empath serves, the avoidant may simply withdraw completely when pursuit ends. The silence reveals that the avoidant held no genuine investment in the empath as individual. The relationship existed solely to serve the avoidant's defensive needs. When those needs can no longer be met through pursuit withdrawal, the avoidant has no reason to maintain connection. If the avoidant has developed genuine attachment to the empath despite their defensive structure, the silence creates more complex internal conflict. The avoidant experiences competing impulses. The familiar defensive urge to withdraw from the discomfort silence creates, an emerging desire to move toward the empath in new ways. This conflict can produce visible distress in the avoidant as they struggle between their conditioned patterns and their authentic feelings. The silence forces this internal struggle into consciousness, preventing the avoidant from continuing the unconscious pattern that previously allowed them to avoid choosing between defense and connection. The empath's silence also eliminates the avoidant's ability to blame relationship problems on the empath's pursuit. Previously, the avoidant could frame the empath's attempts at connection as pressure, neediness, or excessive demands. The avoidant used the empath's pursuit as evidence that the empath caused the relationship difficulties. This externalization protected the avoidant from acknowledging their own emotional unavailability. Silence removes this convenient scapegoat. The quiet cannot be characterized as pursuit or pressure. The empath's withdrawn presence contradicts every narrative the avoidant constructed about the empath's supposed dysfunction. Without the ability to blame the empath's pursuit, the avoidant must confront their own role in the relationship's emptiness. The silence creates clarity about who withdraws and who has been attempting connection. The dynamic becomes visible in ways it never was while the empath actively pursued. The avoidant can no longer obscure their withdrawal behind complaints about the empath's pursuit. The quiet strips away the confusion and reveals the pattern's actual structure. The avoidant creates distance, and the empath has been responding to that distance rather than causing it. This revelation threatens the avoidant's self-concept. Many avoidants have constructed identities around being low maintenance, independent, or emotionally stable compared to their partners. They view themselves as the reasonable party dealing with an overly emotional or demanding partner. The empath's silence dismantles this self-narrative. The quiet demonstrates that the empath possesses the capacity for self-containment and independence the avoidant claimed they lacked. The absence of pursuit reveals that the empath's previous engagement reflected effort to maintain connection with an unavailable partner rather than inherent neediness. The avoidant faces a fundamental choice when silence breaks the familiar pattern. They can acknowledge their defensive limitations and begin genuine work toward relational capacity, or they can maintain their defensive structure and accept the relationship's end. Many avoidants choose defense over relationship, confirming through their choice that they lack readiness or willingness to engage in vulnerable connection. This choice, while painful for the empath to witness, provides valuable information. The silence reveals what years of pursuit obscured, whether the avoidant possesses genuine capacity and desire for mutual relationship, or merely seeks someone to perform the regulatory function that pursuit provides, the uncomfortable mirror silence provides. The empath's verbal communication, regardless of content, provides the avoidant with external focus. When the empath talks, questions, explains, or pursues, the avoidant can direct their attention outward toward managing, deflecting, or withdrawing from the empath's words. This external focus serves protective function, allowing the avoidant to avoid internal examination. The avoidant can spend energy analyzing the empath's communication, finding flaws in the empath's approach, or crafting responses designed to maintain distance. All this activity prevents the avoidant from sitting with their own emotional reality. Silence eliminates this convenient external focus. When the empath becomes quiet, the avoidant loses the distraction that the empath's communication provided. The silence creates psychological space that demands to be filled. Without the empath's words to analyze or deflect from, the avoidant confronts their own internal state. This forced self-focus reveals realities the avoidant's defensive structure exists to avoid. The avoidant must sit with their own feelings, examine their own patterns, and face their own contributions to the relationship's dysfunction. The mirror that silence provides reflects the avoidant's emotional unavailability without distortion. During periods when the empath actively pursues, the relational dynamic contains enough complexity that the avoidant can obscure their withdrawal. The avoidant can point to the empath's pursuit as evidence that connection exists, that the relationship has engagement and energy. The activity of pursuit withdrawal creates surface movement that disguises the underlying emptiness. When silence replaces pursuit, the emptiness becomes undeniable. The quiet reveals the relationship's actual state. One person has been doing all the emotional labor while the other maintains defended distance. This reflection confronts the avoidant with uncomfortable questions they have avoided through years of defensive maneuvering. The avoidant must examine why they cannot sustain emotional presence, why they withdraw from intimacy they claim to desire, why they require pursuit to feel secure yet resent pursuit when it occurs. These questions threaten the avoidant's carefully constructed self-narrative. Most avoidants have convinced themselves that their emotional distance reflects healthy independence, that their withdrawal protects them from partners who want too much, that their unavailability stems from others' inadequacy rather than their own limitations. Silence forces examination of whether these self-narratives contain truth or merely serve defensive functions. The empath's quiet self-containment demonstrates that independence and emotional availability can coexist, that healthy boundaries do not require constant withdrawal, that self-sufficiency does not preclude intimate connection. The avoidant must reconcile their defensive beliefs with the evidence of the empath's silent presence. This reconciliation threatens to expose that the avoidant's withdrawal stems from fear rather than strength, from limitation rather than choice, from defensive necessity rather than authentic preference. The discomfort this mirror creates often intensifies the avoidant's defensive responses. Some avoidants respond to the reflection by attacking the silence itself, characterizing the empath's quiet as manipulation, punishment, or abandonment. These attacks attempt to transform the avoidant's discomfort into the empath's wrongdoing. If the avoidant can successfully reframe silence as the empath's dysfunction, they avoid confronting what the silence actually reveals about their own emotional poverty. The attacks serve to shatter the mirror rather than examine the reflection. Other avoidants respond by attempting to provoke the empath into breaking silence. They create situations designed to force verbal engagement, manufacturing crises, or offering sudden vulnerability calculated to draw the empath back into pursuit. These provocations aim to restore the familiar dynamic where the empath's communication provides distraction from the avoidant's internal reality. When the empath maintains silence despite provocation, the avoidant must confront that their maneuvers no longer work, that they have lost control over the relational pattern they once orchestrated. The mirror's reflection becomes particularly unbearable when the avoidant recognizes their own loneliness. The avoidant's defensive structure typically allows them to attribute loneliness to external circumstances, other people's inadequacy, or situational factors. The avoidant convinces themselves that they would feel connected if only they found the right partner, if only others did not want so much, if only circumstances were different. Silence strips away these rationalizations. The empath's quiet presence demonstrates that a potentially available partner exists, yet the avoidant still experiences disconnection. This reality suggests that loneliness stems from the avoidant's own unavailability rather than from external factors beyond their control. This recognition creates existential crisis for avoidants who have organized their entire identity around their defensive structure. If their withdrawal causes their loneliness rather than protecting them from harm, if their emotional distance creates isolation rather than independence, if their unavailability reflects limitation rather than strength, then the avoidant must question the fundamental approach they have taken to relationships throughout their life. This questioning threatens the psychological defenses that have protected the avoidant from overwhelming vulnerability since early developmental experiences taught them that emotional openness leads to pain. The silence holds the mirror steady regardless of the avoidant's discomfort or defensive maneuvers. Unlike verbal communication that the avoidant can deflect, reframe, or withdraw from, silence simply exists. The quiet reflects reality without argument or explanation. The avoidant cannot debate with silence, cannot convince the quiet to distort its reflection, cannot manipulate the mirror into showing something other than truth. This unwavering reflection creates pressure that builds over time, forcing the avoidant toward either genuine self-examination or complete relationship termination. The middle ground where pursuit withdrawal allowed connection without vulnerability no longer exists.